The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood why. My hands were already moving across the gunnery panel when Captain Owen Blake's voice cut through the bridge like a blade. "Battle stations," he said, and the word hit me harder than the alarm ever could. I had trained for this moment for 3 years, but nothing prepares you for the second it actually arrives. My name is Daniel Ford, and I was standing at the forward cannon station of the Reckoning when the galaxy stopped laughing at us. Just an hour earlier, I had been eating a cold meal in the mess hall, half listening to the broadcast from the Galactic Council chamber. A delegate with pale silver skin and eyes like polished stone was holding up a diagram of our battleship, pointing at the long metal barrels mounted along its hull. The chamber had erupted in laughter, dozens of species from 100 worlds finding humor in something they did not understand. I remember feeling my face grow hot with embarrassment, even though I was millions of kilometers away from that chamber. My crewmates barely looked up from their food. Lieutenant Mara Finch, sitting across from me, simply shrugged and said that laughter was cheap and cannons were not. I did not know then how right she was. The galaxy we had joined was not the galaxy of old stories. There were no burning cities, no desperate last stands, no grand battles fought with courage alone. War, if you could call it that, had become something closer to a formal debate. Ships with perfect energy shields exchanged beams of light that shimmered harmlessly against those shields, and when enough energy had been absorbed, a ship would simply power down and retreat. It was called a resolution engagement. Nobody was hurt, nobody lost their ship. It was, by every measure the Council cared about, civilized. Humanity did not fit into that picture, and everyone knew it. We had arrived in the wider galaxy only a few decades earlier, stumbling into contact with older civilizations that had already spent centuries perfecting their shield technology. Our scientists studied their methods, tried to replicate their success, and failed again and again. Our shields were weak, inconsistent, prone to failure under the mildest pressure. While other species spent their resources refining elegant defensive systems, we spent ours doing something the rest of the galaxy considered almost embarrassing. We built cannons, real, physical cannons, firing solid projectiles at speeds that made the void itself seem to bend. I remember the day our chief engineer, a quiet woman named Priya Sen, gave a briefing to new officers like me. She stood in front of a hologram of the Reckoning's hull and explained, in that calm voice of hers, why we had chosen to build weapons that seemed to belong in a museum rather than in space. "If we cannot stop a blow," she said, "then we will make sure our blow cannot be stopped either." It was not elegant. It was not something the Council would ever admire, but it was honest, in a way that their glowing shields were not. At the time, sitting in that briefing room, I did not fully understand the weight of her words. I only understood that I had signed up to serve on a ship that the rest of the galaxy found ridiculous. There were nights, especially early in my service, when I wondered if I had made a mistake. Other cadets from allied worlds would visit our ship and walk along the gun deck with expressions somewhere between curiosity and pity, as if they were looking at relics rather than weapons. One young officer from a neighboring system, a tall being named Sel Vantor, asked me directly why humanity insisted on clinging to what he called crude technology. I did not have a good answer for him then. That question would follow me for months, whispered in my mind every time I walked past the long steel barrels of our forward battery. It followed me into training exercises, into diplomatic briefings, into quiet moments on watch when the stars outside the viewport seemed to mock the entire idea of human stubbornness. And it followed me all the way to the day the Council decided to make an example of us. The invitation came wrapped in polite language, the kind diplomats use when they want to humiliate someone without technically breaking any rules. A training encounter, they called it, a demonstration of technological cooperation between member species. In truth, it was an audition, and everyone on the Reckoning knew it. The Council wanted proof that humanity's stubborn attachment to cannons was nothing more than a fear of modern technology, a fear that could be gently corrected in front of witnesses. Captain Blake did not seem worried when the orders came through. He read the message twice, set it down on his desk, and looked at the assembled officers in the briefing room with an expression I would only later learn to recognize as quiet confidence. He told us that the council could think whatever it wanted. Our task was simple: show up, follow the rules of the exercise, and let the results speak for themselves. I did not sleep well that night. I kept thinking about how the laughter in that council chamber had sounded, how easily an entire species could be reduced to an object of amusement because it refused to abandon what had once kept it alive. I thought about my grandmother, who used to tell stories about a time on Earth when nations fought each other with weapons far crueler than anything we carried now, and how those stories had shaped the way our engineers thought about survival. She used to say that history does not forgive those who forget its lessons, and sitting there in the dark of my quarters, I finally understood what she meant. The morning of the exercise arrived with an unsettling calm. The Reckoning drifted into position at the edge of a designated testing zone, a wide stretch of empty space marked only by navigational beacons. Across from us, a sleek council escort ship waited, its hull polished to a mirror shine, its shield generators already humming with visible energy. Compared to our blunt gray battleship, it looked like a work of art standing next to a piece of scrap metal. Observers from a dozen species had gathered aboard nearby vessels to watch the exercise unfold. I could see their ships clustered at a respectful distance, sensors trained on us like an audience waiting for a show. Ambassador Grace Whitfield, the human diplomat assigned to oversee the exercise, stood on our bridge with her arms folded, her expression unreadable. She had fought hard to prevent this exercise from happening, but the Council had insisted, framing it as an opportunity for humanity to prove itself, rather than an attempt to embarrass us. Captain Blake gave the order to power down our shields entirely, a move that made several officers glance at each other in confusion. Sel Vantor, who had been assigned to observe from our bridge as part of the exercise, raised an eyebrow and asked if the captain understood the risk he was taking. Blake simply replied that shields had never been our strength, and that pretending otherwise would only waste time. Then he ordered the forward cannons armed. I felt my pulse quicken as I ran through the final checks on my console. The barrels of the Reckoning's main battery rotated slowly outward, catching the distant light of a nearby star. On the other side of the testing zone, the Council escort ship's shields brightened, ready to absorb whatever we intended to throw at it. Its crew, I imagined, were probably as confident as the delegates who had laughed in that chamber days earlier. The countdown began, a calm, mechanical voice echoing through the bridge. 5, 4, 3. My hands rested steady on the firing controls, steadier than I expected them to be. 2, 1. And then, for the first time since I had joined the crew of the Reckoning, I understood exactly why we had never let go of the old ways. The sound came before the sight, a deep rolling boom that seemed to pass through the hull itself, rather than travel through the vacuum outside. I felt it in my chest, in the soles of my boots, a vibration that no glowing beam of light had ever produced. On the main view screen, a streak of dull grey light shot across the black expanse, toward the waiting escort ship, moving faster than anything the observing crews had likely ever tracked. I watched the enemy shields flare instantly, brightening in a desperate attempt to absorb the incoming impact, the way they had absorbed 1,000 energy blasts before. For a fraction of a second, it seemed as though the shield would hold, the same way it always had against every other weapon in the galaxy. Then the projectile struck, and the shield did something no one on that ship had ever seen it do before. It simply failed to matter. The physical mass and speed of our cannon fire tore through the shield's energy field as if it were nothing more than mist, the kinetic force finding no resistance in a system designed to stop light rather than matter. I saw the impact ripple across the escort ship's hull, a shudder passing through its frame that had nothing to do with heat or radiation, and everything to do with simple, brutal physics. For a long moment, no one on our bridge said a word. Even Selvantor, who had spent the entire morning questioning our methods, stood frozen, staring at the view screen, with an expression I had never seen on his face before. The observing ships that had gathered to watch our humiliation had gone completely silent on every open channel, their sensors still locked onto the drifting form of the escort ship, its outer hull scarred in a way that no amount of shield technology had ever prepared them to expect. Captain Blake did not smile, did not celebrate, did not do anything that might have looked like triumph. He simply turned to the communications officer and asked for a status report on the escort ship's crew, his voice as steady as it had been before the countdown began. I remember thinking, in that strange, quiet moment, that this was exactly the kind of restraint my grandmother used to describe when she talked about the lessons of the past. Power without control was nothing more than another kind of foolishness, and Captain Blake seemed determined not to make that mistake in front of an entire galaxy that was suddenly watching us in a completely different way. The escort ship's crew, we would later learn, was shaken but unharmed, protected by internal safety systems that had never been designed with this kind of impact in mind. The exercise, meant to prove our stubbornness foolish, had instead revealed something the Council had never considered. In their pursuit of elegant, harmless technology, they had built an entire civilization around a single point of failure, and humanity, through nothing more than old-fashioned persistence, had just found it. I sat at my station long after the order came to stand down, staring at the empty space where the countdown numbers had been, and I thought about all the nights I had questioned whether serving on this ship was a mistake. I thought about the laughter in that council chamber, the pity in the eyes of visiting officers, the quiet doubts that had followed me through every training exercise. None of that laughter existed anymore, not in that testing zone, not among the observing ships whose sensors were still locked onto the drifting form of the council escort vessel. Something had changed in the span of a few seconds, and I understood, even then, that we would spend the rest of our lives dealing with the consequences of that change. Ambassador Whitfield was the first to break the silence on our bridge, her voice quiet but firm as she requested an open channel to the observing fleet. She did not gloat, did not offer any triumphant remarks, simply informed the assembled delegates that the exercise had concluded and that humanity looked forward to discussing the results at the Council's convenience. It was a small, careful sentence, but I could hear something new in the way she said it. For the first time since I had known her, she did not sound like someone pleading to be taken seriously. She sounded like someone who no longer needed to. Selvantor finally spoke, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it, admitting that he had never seen a shield fail in that manner during his entire career. He asked, almost hesitantly, whether our engineers had known this would happen, whether the entire exercise had been some kind of calculated demonstration rather than an honest test. Captain Blake shook his head and told him the truth, that we had simply built our weapons to work, regardless of what the enemy's defenses were designed to stop. It was not calculation, it was preparation, built on decades of a philosophy the rest of the galaxy had dismissed as primitive. As the reckoning turned slowly away from the testing zone, I found myself staring out at the drifting escort ship one last time, its polished hull no longer looking quite so untouchable. I thought about the delegates who had laughed at our diagrams, the officers who had pitied our gun decks, the quiet doubts that had haunted me through every long watch aboard this ship. None of that would matter anymore, not in the way it once had. We had not fired those cannons out of anger or cruelty. We had fired them because we understood something the rest of the galaxy had forgotten, buried under generations of elegant, comfortable technology. Strength that cannot be tested is not truly strength at all, and the galaxy, whether it wanted to admit it or not, had just been given a very expensive lesson in that simple, uncomfortable truth. I did not know it then, standing at my station, as the adrenaline slowly drained from my body, but that single exercise would change everything about how the galaxy viewed humanity, and everything about how humanity viewed itself. The laughter was gone. In its place was something far more complicated, something that would follow us into every council chamber, every diplomatic meeting, and every quiet conversation among species who had built their entire civilization around the comfortable belief that war, in its old and brutal form, was a thing of the past. They were about to learn just how wrong that belief had always been. Word of the exercise spread faster than any of us expected, racing across communication networks that connected 100 worlds in a matter of hours. I remember standing in the observation deck later that evening, watching the stars drift past the viewport, when Lieutenant Finch found me there. She did not say much at first, simply stood beside me in silence, watching the same endless field of stars I had been staring at for the better part of an hour. Eventually she spoke, her voice thoughtful rather than triumphant. She said that for the first time since joining this crew, she felt like the rest of the galaxy finally understood something about us that we had always known about ourselves. We were not interested in proving we were the strongest, or the most advanced, or the most elegant. We were interested in surviving, in preparing for outcomes that comfortable civilizations preferred not to imagine. That, she said, was the real lesson of today, buried underneath all the noise and shock of the exercise itself. I thought about her words long after she left the observation deck, long after the lights along the corridor dimmed for the night cycle, long after the adrenaline of the exercise had finally faded from my body. Somewhere out there, in council chambers and diplomatic offices across 100 worlds, delegates were scrambling to understand what had just happened, replaying sensor logs, questioning assumptions they had never thought to question before. And somewhere out there, on ships far more advanced than ours, in gleaming halls filled with elegant technology and confident promises of safety, an entire galaxy was quietly beginning to realize that the joke it had shared just hours earlier was no longer funny at all. 3 days after the exercise, I found myself standing outside the officers' briefing room, listening to Chief Engineer Priya Sen argue quietly with a visiting delegation from the Council's technical division. They had arrived aboard a sleek transport ship, eager to understand exactly how our cannons had defeated shield technology that had never failed in over 2 centuries of recorded use. I was not supposed to be listening, but curiosity kept my feet planted just outside the door, my hand resting on a nearby console, as if I had some official reason to be standing there. The lead delegate, a broad-shouldered being with deep blue skin and calm, deliberate movements, kept returning to the same question in different forms. How had we known this would work? Priya answered each version of the question with the same patient honesty. We did not know, not with certainty. We had built our weapons around a principle rather than a guarantee, understanding that shields designed to stop energy might struggle against pure physical mass moving at extreme velocity. It was not a secret formula. It was simply a choice made decades earlier, when our ancestors realized they could not compete with the galaxy's elegant defensive technology and decided to build something that did not depend on being stopped in the first place. I thought back to my earliest days of training, sitting in that same briefing room while Priya explained the philosophy behind our weapons systems to a room full of skeptical young officers. At the time, her words had felt like a justification for something embarrassing, an explanation offered to soften the sting of being different. Standing outside that door now, listening to a council delegate struggle to understand a concept that had once seemed so simple to us, I realized how much the meaning of her words had changed in just a few days. The visiting delegation left the ship later that afternoon, their expressions carrying a mixture of confusion and something I could only describe as quiet unease. I caught a glimpse of the lead delegate pausing at the airlock, glancing back down the corridor toward the gun deck, as if trying to memorize every detail of a place he had never expected to take seriously. That evening, Captain Blake called a general briefing for the entire crew, something he rarely did outside of emergency situations. The bridge crew gathered in the main hall, along with engineers, gunnery officers, and support staff who rarely had reason to leave their stations during normal operations. I found a seat near the back, next to Lieutenant Finch, who offered me a small, knowing smile as the captain stepped up to address us. Blake did not waste time on speeches about pride or victory. Instead, he spoke plainly about what the exercise meant for our future and what it did not mean. He reminded us that a single demonstration, however dramatic, did not erase decades of doubt overnight. Other species would not simply accept defeat and move on. Some would study our methods and attempt to adapt. Others would grow suspicious, even fearful, of a species that had spent so long quietly preparing for conflicts everyone else assumed had become obsolete. I remember feeling a chill run through me at those words, not because I doubted the captain's judgment, but because I finally understood the weight of what we had done. We had not simply won an exercise. We had disturbed something the rest of the galaxy had built its entire sense of safety around, and disturbed civilizations rarely responded with calm curiosity alone. Over the following weeks, life aboard the Reckoning settled into a strange new rhythm. Training exercises continued as they always had, but the atmosphere around them had shifted in subtle ways. Visiting officers from allied worlds, who had once walked our gun deck with expressions of polite pity, now studied the long steel barrels with careful, calculating eyes. Selvantor, who had questioned our methods so openly before the exercise, began spending long hours in the engineering section, asking Priya detailed questions about propulsion systems, projectile design, and the mathematics behind kinetic force. I found myself growing closer to him during this time, an unexpected friendship built on mutual curiosity rather than shared background. He explained to me, over quiet meals in the mess hall, how deeply the concept of physical weaponry had faded from his own people's history. His species had abandoned kinetic technology generations earlier, embracing energy-based systems as a sign of progress and sophistication. The idea that an older, simpler technology might succeed where their advanced systems failed had shaken something fundamental in the way he understood strength itself. I asked him once, during one of these quiet conversations, whether he regretted his earlier doubts about our ship. He considered the question for a long moment before answering, choosing his words carefully. He said that doubt was not something to regret, only something to learn from. What troubled him now was not the fact that he had been wrong, but the realization that an entire civilization, his own included, had built its confidence around assumptions no one had ever bothered to test. Not everyone aboard Allied ships shared his willingness to reconsider old assumptions. Reports began filtering in from other sectors of increasingly tense diplomatic exchanges, as delegates from more conservative worlds accused humanity of deliberately humiliating the Council for political advantage. Ambassador Whitfield spent long hours in closed communications with representatives from a dozen different systems, carefully navigating a wave of suspicion that threatened to undo whatever goodwill the exercise had earned us. I was not present for most of these conversations, but Lieutenant Finch, who often assisted with communications during high-level briefings, shared what she could, without violating confidentiality. She told me that some delegates viewed our success not as an achievement to be respected, but as evidence of a dangerous mindset, a species too comfortable with the idea of overwhelming force. It was a strange kind of criticism to sit with, considering how the very same species had laughed at our diagrams only weeks earlier for daring to imagine that conflict might still require preparation for the worst. I began to understand, during those long weeks, that the galaxy's discomfort with us ran deeper than simple technological rivalry. It touched something more fundamental, a quiet fear that had been buried beneath generations of comfortable peace. If humanity's old-fashioned philosophy could succeed where elegant modern systems failed, then perhaps the peace so many species had come to depend on was far more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. Priya Sen addressed this fear directly during a private conversation I overheard between her and Captain Blake in the engineering bay. She explained that humanity had never set out to prove anyone wrong. Our methods were not born from a desire for dominance, but from a painful history that had taught us, sometimes at great cost, that safety could never be fully guaranteed by elegance alone. She reminded the captain that our ancestors had once believed the same comfortable lies other species believed now, and had paid dearly for that belief more than once throughout our history. Blake listened carefully, nodding along with her words, before adding a thought of his own. He said that perhaps the greatest gift we could offer the galaxy was not our cannons, but our willingness to remember lessons that others had chosen to forget. It was not a gift anyone had asked for, and it was certainly not one that would be welcomed with open arms. But it was, in his view, the most honest thing we had to offer a civilization that had grown a little too comfortable in its own sense of safety. As the weeks passed, I noticed subtle changes beginning to ripple through Allied fleets across the sector. Reports arrived, describing small, quiet modifications being made to ships belonging to species that had once dismissed kinetic weaponry entirely. Engineers on distant worlds began experimenting with reinforced hull plating, testing theoretical designs for projectile-based defense systems that had not been seriously considered in generations. It was as if a single crack had appeared in a wall everyone had believed was solid, and that crack was slowly beginning to spread. I found myself thinking often about my grandmother during this period, remembering the stories she used to tell about old conflicts on Earth, long before humanity had ever imagined reaching the stars. She used to say that peace built on forgetting was never truly peace at all, only a pause between lessons the world had not yet finished teaching. I wondered, watching the galaxy slowly begin to stir around us, whether we had just triggered exactly the kind of lesson she used to warn me about. Selvantor voiced a similar concern one evening, as we stood together on the observation deck watching the stars drift silently past the viewport. He admitted that part of him wished the exercise had never happened, that the comfortable illusions his people had built their society around could have remained intact a little longer. But another part of him, he confessed, felt a strange sense of relief, as if some deeply buried instinct within him had finally been allowed to wake up after generations of quiet slumber. I did not have an answer for him that night, only a quiet understanding that our conversation, like so many others happening across the galaxy in those weeks, was part of something much larger than either of us could fully grasp. We had not simply demonstrated a weapon, we had reopened a question the galaxy had long assumed was settled, and questions like that, once reopened, rarely closed again quietly. By the end of that month, the Reckoning received new orders that would carry us far beyond the quiet training exercises and diplomatic briefings that had defined our recent weeks. The galaxy, it seemed, was no longer content to simply study us from a distance. It wanted to see, with its own eyes, exactly what humanity was capable of when circumstances demanded more than a carefully controlled demonstration. I did not know it then, standing on that observation deck beside a friend from a world so different from my own, but the quiet unease stirring across the galaxy was only the beginning. What waited for us beyond the safety of our training exercises would test everything we believed about our own philosophy, and force an entire galaxy to finally confront the lesson it had spent generations trying to avoid. The new orders arrived without warning, delivered through a priority channel that immediately pulled Captain Blake away from a routine maintenance meeting. I was on the bridge when the message came through, and I watched his expression shift from mild curiosity to something far more focused as he read the details on his console. He did not share the contents immediately, only instructed the navigation officer to plot a course toward a distant system near the edge of Council territory, a region I had never heard mentioned in any of our previous briefings. It took another hour before the full crew learned what was happening. A small colony world, home to a peaceful, non-aligned species called the Threll, had reported unusual activity near its outer settlements. Scavenger vessels, unaffiliated with any recognized council member, had been spotted probing the colony's minimal defenses, testing response times and communication patterns in a manner that suggested far more than simple curiosity. The Threll had no significant defense fleet of their own, having relied for generations on distant relationships with larger powers to deter exactly this kind of threat. Ambassador Whitfield explained during the briefing that the Council had quietly asked several member species to send ships toward the region as a show of support, a subtle warning to whoever was testing the colony's defenses. To everyone's surprise, including our own, the Reckoning had been specifically requested among the responding vessels. I remember the murmur that spread through the briefing room at that announcement, a mixture of pride and apprehension that I felt echoed in my own chest. Selvantor, still officially assigned to our ship as part of the ongoing diplomatic exchange, asked the question most of us were thinking, but hesitant to voice aloud. Why would the Council request a ship it had spent months trying to publicly discredit? Ambassador Whitfield did not offer a comfortable answer. She simply said that fear had a way of changing priorities faster than pride ever could, and that the same delegates who had mocked our cannons weeks earlier were now quietly grateful those cannons existed. The journey toward the colony system took several days, time I spent reviewing tactical simulations alongside Lieutenant Finch, trying to anticipate scenarios that felt increasingly less theoretical with each passing hour. I had trained for years on simulated engagements, but something about this mission felt different, heavier, in a way that no simulation had ever managed to capture. This was not an exercise arranged for an audience of curious observers. Real people, on a real world, were waiting to see whether the strange, mock technology aboard our ship could actually protect them. We arrived at the edge of the colony system, just as local sensors detected a cluster of unidentified vessels approaching the outer settlements from an uncharted trajectory. The scavenger ships, larger and more heavily modified than the Threll's initial reports had suggested, moved with a coordinated precision that immediately told me this was no random opportunistic raid. Someone had planned this carefully, likely counting on the colony's lack of defenses and the Council's slow bureaucratic response times to secure whatever resources they were after. Captain Blake wasted no time issuing orders once our sensors confirmed the threat. The reckoning moved into position between the approaching vessels and the colony's main settlement, our presence alone causing an immediate, visible hesitation among the scavenger fleet. I watched from my station as their formation broke apart slightly, ships pulling back into a more cautious spread, clearly recalculating whatever plan they had arrived with. Ambassador Whitfield opened a communication channel, attempting to establish contact and offer the scavenger fleet a chance to withdraw peacefully. For several tense minutes, there was no response, only silence stretching across the growing distance between our ship and theirs. I kept my hands steady on the gunnery controls, watching the tactical display update with each subtle shift in their formation, waiting for a decision that felt entirely out of my control. The silence broke when one of the scavenger vessels suddenly accelerated toward the colony's outer settlement, breaking away from the main formation in an obvious attempt to force a confrontation before the rest of their fleet could be properly identified or challenged. Captain Blake's response was immediate and calm, ordering our ship to intercept while maintaining strict rules of engagement that prioritized protecting the colony over pursuing any direct confrontation with the fleet itself. I felt the same steady vibration beneath my station that I remembered from the exercise weeks earlier as our engines shifted into a higher output, propelling the reckoning into a defensive position between the colony and the approaching scavenger vessel. This time, there were no observing fleets gathered to watch a controlled demonstration. There was only the quiet, tense reality of a real threat testing whether we would actually do what our reputation now suggested we could. The scavenger vessel did not slow down, its trajectory suggesting either desperation or a serious miscalculation of what it was approaching. Captain Blake gave the order to fire a single warning shot, a calculated display meant to demonstrate capability without escalating the situation unnecessarily. I watched the projectile streak across the black expanse, deliberately aimed to pass close enough to be unmistakable without making direct contact with the fleeing vessel. The effect was immediate. The scavenger ship altered course sharply, breaking away from its approach toward the colony and rejoining the rest of its scattered formation at a much safer distance. Over the following minutes, the entire scavenger fleet began a slow, cautious retreat, their earlier confidence completely replaced by an obvious reluctance to test whatever technology had just demonstrated its reach without any need for further explanation. I released a breath I had not realized I was holding as the tactical display confirmed the scavenger fleet's withdrawal from the system entirely. Around me, the bridge crew exchanged quiet glances of relief, though no one spoke openly about what had just happened. It was Lieutenant Finch who eventually broke the silence, observing quietly that a single warning shot had accomplished more in a few tense minutes than an entire fleet of elegant, energy-based warships might have managed through hours of careful, ritualized negotiation. Ambassador Whitfield opened communications with the Threll settlement soon after the scavenger fleet's departure, offering reassurance and coordinating with local leaders on further security measures. I listened to portions of that exchange from my station, struck by the genuine gratitude in the voices of the colony representatives, a stark contrast to the polite condescension I had grown used to hearing from more established council members during our earlier diplomatic exchanges. Selvantor approached me later that evening, finding me in the observation deck once again, a place that seemed to have become an unofficial gathering point for quiet reflection aboard the Reckoning. He admitted that watching the events unfold from the bridge had changed something in his understanding of our ship's purpose. It was one thing to witness a demonstration designed to prove a point in front of an audience. It was another entirely to watch a single warning shot protect an entire community that had no other means of defending itself. I told him about my grandmother's stories again that evening, the ones about old conflicts on Earth long before humanity had ever imagined reaching beyond its own solar system. She explained how those stories had shaped an entire philosophy passed down through generations of engineers and officers, a philosophy built not around the desire for conflict, but around the quiet recognition that peace, however comfortable it felt, could never be entirely guaranteed. Sel Vantor listened carefully, nodding along in a way that told me he was beginning to understand something about us that went far deeper than the mechanics of our weapons systems. News of the incident spread quickly through council channels over the following days, carried alongside detailed reports from Threll representatives who spoke openly about the relief and gratitude they felt toward our intervention. I noticed a subtle shift in the tone of official communications directed toward our ship, a shift that Ambassador Whitfield later confirmed during a private conversation with the senior officers. The same delegates who had once dismissed our technology as primitive were now quietly requesting further details about our capabilities, careful to frame their curiosity as professional interest rather than admission of earlier misjudgment. Captain Blake remained characteristically measured in his response to the growing attention, reminding the crew during a brief address that gratitude, much like earlier mockery, was often temporary and easily influenced by whatever fear or comfort happened to be dominant at any given moment. He encouraged us not to grow complacent, reminding us that our purpose had never been to earn approval from a galaxy that had spent generations doubting our methods, but simply to remain prepared for realities that comfortable civilizations too often preferred to ignore. I carried his words with me over the following weeks as the Reckoning continued its patrol along the outer regions of Council territory, responding to smaller incidents that rarely made it into official reports but nonetheless reinforced the quiet value of our presence. Each encounter, however minor, seemed to chip away a little further at the comfortable assumptions that had once defined the galaxy's understanding of security. It was during one of these patrols that Priya Sen shared a piece of information with the senior officers that would eventually shape everything that followed. Her engineering team, monitoring communications traffic across several neighboring systems, had detected unusual patterns suggesting that multiple species were quietly accelerating research into kinetic weapon systems similar to our own. What had once been dismissed as an embarrassing relic of a less sophisticated species was rapidly becoming a subject of serious, if reluctant, scientific interest across a growing number of worlds. I remember feeling a strange mixture of pride and unease at that news, an emotion I struggled to fully articulate even to myself. Part of me felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that our long history of preparation had finally been recognized as valuable rather than foolish. But another part of me, the part shaped by my grandmother's careful warnings, understood that a galaxy rapidly rearming itself was not necessarily a safer galaxy, regardless of how justified that rearmament might seem in the wake of recent events. Selvantor voiced a similar concern during one of our now regular conversations on the observation deck, admitting that his own government had quietly authorized new research initiatives focused on kinetic weapon technology in the weeks following our encounter with the scavenger fleet. He confessed that watching this shift unfold felt less like progress and more like an entire civilization slowly waking up to a threat it had convinced itself no longer existed. I did not have a comforting answer to offer him that evening, only a quiet acknowledgement that the galaxy we had known just a few short months earlier was already beginning to change in ways none of us could fully predict. What had started as a single demonstration meant to answer public mockery had quietly grown into something far larger, a slow but unmistakable shift in how an entire community of worlds understood its own safety. As the Reckoning continued its patrol along the quiet edges of Council territory, I found myself wondering how far this shift would eventually spread, and whether the galaxy that had once laughed at our cannons was truly prepared for the world it was now, however reluctantly, beginning to build for itself. The message that changed everything arrived just after the start of the night cycle, when most of the crew had already retired to their quarters and only a skeleton team remained active on the bridge. I was among them, covering a routine communications watch, when the distress signal broke through every open channel at once, overriding standard priority protocols in a way that immediately told me something had gone seriously wrong. The signal originated from a research outpost stationed near the border of a contested region, a small facility operated jointly by several council member species to monitor an unstable stretch of space long avoided by most commercial traffic. The message was fragmented, cutting in and out as whoever transmitted it struggled against interference I did not yet understand. What came through clearly enough was a single, urgent phrase repeated twice before the signal cut out entirely. Unknown hostile vessels, weapons active, requesting immediate assistance. Captain Blake was on the bridge within minutes, still fastening the collar of his uniform as he took his position and demanded a full status report. Lieutenant Finch relayed everything we had, which was frustratingly little. The outpost's exact situation remained unclear, its communication system apparently damaged before a complete picture could be transmitted. What we did know was our own position, close enough to the affected region that the reckoning had been automatically flagged as the nearest capable responder. There was no debate about what came next. Blake ordered an immediate course change, and I felt the deck shift subtly beneath my feet as the ship's engines roared to life at full capacity. Every officer on the bridge moved with a focused urgency I had only glimpsed once before, during the brief tension of our encounter with the scavenger fleet. This time, the uncertainty felt heavier, the stakes far less predictable. We arrived at the outpost roughly 2 hours later, emerging from transit into a scene that immediately confirmed our worst assumptions. The research facility, once a modest cluster of interconnected modules orbiting a quiet gas giant, now drifted at an unnatural angle, visible damage scarring its outer hull in multiple locations. Surrounding it, spread across the surrounding space in a loose, aggressive formation, was a fleet unlike anything we had encountered before. Sensor analysis identified the attacking vessels as belonging to a faction operating outside recognized Council authority, a group that had grown increasingly active along the galaxy's contested frontiers in recent months. Unlike the disorganized scavenger fleet from our earlier encounter, these ships moved with disciplined precision, their formation suggesting genuine military training rather than opportunistic raiding. Priya Sen, monitoring engineering readouts from her station, confirmed what our sensors already suggested. These vessels carried modern energy shields, likely acquired or stolen from more established powers, and appeared prepared for a sustained engagement. Captain Blake's voice remained steady as he issued orders, though I could hear the weight of the situation pressing beneath his usual calm. He instructed Ambassador Whitfield to attempt contact with the outpost's surviving personnel, while simultaneously ordering the crew to full combat readiness. I felt my hands tighten around the gunnery controls, memories of our earlier exercise flashing briefly through my mind before I forced myself to focus entirely on the moment in front of me. The attacking fleet noticed our arrival almost immediately, several vessels breaking away from their assault on the outpost to reposition toward the reckoning. I counted 6 ships in total, smaller and faster than our own vessel, but numerous enough to present a genuine tactical challenge. Captain Blake calculated the risk quickly, recognizing that a defensive posture alone would not be enough to protect whatever survivors remained aboard the damaged outpost. He gave the order to advance, positioning the reckoning directly between the outpost and the majority of the attacking fleet, buying time for Ambassador Whitfield to establish contact with anyone still alive inside the facility. I watched the tactical display update rapidly as the enemy formation adjusted, clearly recalculating their approach in response to our unexpected arrival. For a tense moment, neither side made any aggressive move, each apparently assessing the other's intentions before committing to action neither could easily reverse. The silence broke when one of the smaller attacking vessels fired a warning shot of its own, a bright pulse of energy that struck harmlessly against empty space well clear of our hull. It was, I realized, a message rather than an attack, an attempt to test our resolve before committing to a full engagement. Captain Blake did not hesitate in his response, ordering our forward cannons armed while maintaining an otherwise defensive posture, a clear signal that we would not retreat, but had no interest in escalating the situation further than necessary. Ambassador Whitfield finally established a fragile connection with the outpost, her voice tight with concentration as she relayed critical information to the bridge. Several researchers remain trapped in a partially depressurized section of the facility, their survival dependent on emergency systems that would not hold much longer without external assistance. Captain Blake made the decision immediately, ordering a rescue team to prepare for immediate deployment while the Reckoning maintained its defensive position against the surrounding fleet. I understood, in that moment, that our mission had shifted from simple deterrence to something far more urgent. Protecting the rescue team meant holding our position against a numerically superior force, buying enough time for survivors to be extracted safely before the situation deteriorated further. The weight of that responsibility settled heavily across the bridge, visible in the tightened expressions of every officer around me. The attacking fleet, apparently unwilling to allow the rescue attempt to proceed unchallenged, began advancing in a coordinated pincer formation, clearly intent on splitting our attention between defending the outpost and protecting our own hull. Captain Blake responded with calm, decisive orders, directing our maneuvering thrusters to keep the Reckoning positioned as a shield between the outpost and the majority of the incoming fleet, even as smaller vessels attempted to slip past our flanks. I fired our first true shot of the engagement when one of the smaller enemy ships broke formation, attempting a direct run toward the outpost's damaged hull where our rescue team had just begun their delicate extraction. The projectile found its mark cleanly, striking the vessel's shield generator with enough force to disable it entirely, sending the ship tumbling harmlessly away from its intended trajectory. There was no time to feel relief. Two more vessels immediately adjusted their approach, clearly recalculating their strategy in response to the loss of their companion ship. The engagement that followed remains, even now, a blur of rapid decisions and controlled precision rather than any single dramatic moment. Captain Blake directed our fire with careful discipline, targeting propulsion and shield systems rather than attempting to destroy the attacking vessels outright, a restraint that surprised me, even as I executed each order without hesitation. Priyasen later explained that this restraint had been deliberate from the very beginning of our engagement protocols, built around the same philosophy that shaped every other aspect of our approach to conflict. Disable the threat, minimize unnecessary harm, protect what matters most. The rescue team successfully extracted the remaining survivors just as the attacking fleet, having lost 3 vessels to disabling fire and facing a defensive position they could not easily overcome, began a hurried retreat toward the edge of the contested region. Captain Blake did not order pursuit, choosing instead to hold our position and confirm the safety of everyone aboard the damaged outpost before allowing the crew even a moment to process what had just happened. I sat at my station long after the tactical display finally cleared, my hands trembling slightly with the after-effects of sustained tension I had not fully acknowledged during the engagement itself. Lieutenant Finch appeared beside me, offering a quiet nod of acknowledgement rather than any words, an understanding passing silently between us that no explanation could have properly captured. The survivors we recovered from the outpost, shaken but alive, offered emotional gratitude that stood in sharp contrast to the polite, distant respect we had grown accustomed to receiving from established council delegates. One researcher, an elderly scientist from a species I did not immediately recognize, gripped my hand tightly as she was escorted through our corridors, repeating a simple, heartfelt thank you that I found myself unable to respond to with anything beyond a quiet nod. Captain Blake addressed the crew briefly before allowing anyone to rest, his voice carrying none of the triumph I might have expected after such a decisive engagement. He reminded us that today's outcome, however successful, had come at a cost that could not be measured simply in terms of damaged enemy vessels or rescued survivors. Somewhere out there, an organized force capable of coordinated military action had just tested our capabilities directly, and would undoubtedly study the results of that test far more carefully than any council delegate ever had. I lay awake long into the ship's night cycle, replaying the engagement over and over in my mind, searching for moments where a different decision might have changed the outcome entirely. It was not fear that kept me awake, not exactly, but a deeper, more unsettling awareness that had been slowly building within me since the day the galaxy first learned to stop laughing at us. We had proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, that our old-fashioned philosophy could succeed where elegant modern systems failed. But proof, I was beginning to understand, came with its own quiet, unavoidable price. Word of the outpost rescue reached the Galactic Council long before we returned to more familiar territory, carried through official channels by survivors eager to share their account of what had happened. I expected, given the outcome, that our arrival at the Council's central station would be met with a measure of gratitude, perhaps even a formal acknowledgement of the role our old-fashioned technology had played in saving lives that more conventional methods might not have reached in time. What greeted us instead was something far more complicated. Ambassador Whitfield informed the senior officers, shortly after our arrival, that a special subcommittee had been convened to review the engagement in detail, and that testimony would be required from those directly involved. She did not need to explain the tone of the request. I could hear it clearly enough in the careful, formal language of the summons itself, a tone that suggested scrutiny rather than celebration. I was among those called to testify, a fact that surprised me given my relatively junior position aboard the Reckoning. Captain Blake explained, during a brief conversation before our departure for the Council station, that the subcommittee specifically wanted perspectives from officers who had been directly involved in operating the weapons systems, rather than relying solely on command-level summaries. It was, I suspected, an attempt to better understand not just what had happened, but how easily such decisions had been made in the heat of an unpredictable engagement. The Council station itself was unlike anything I had experienced before, a vast structure suspended in open space, its interior a labyrinth of corridors connecting chambers dedicated to governance, diplomacy, and the countless bureaucratic functions required to maintain order among 100 different worlds. I felt distinctly out of place walking those corridors, aware of curious glances from delegates and staff belonging to species whose names I still struggled to remember correctly. The subcommittee chamber itself was smaller than I expected, a circular room lined with seating for perhaps 20 delegates, each representing a different member species with a stake in matters of galactic security. I took my place at a modest podium positioned at the center of the room, acutely aware of the weight of attention now focused entirely on me. The questioning began cautiously enough, delegates requesting basic details about the engagement timeline, weapon specifications, and standard operational procedures. I answered each question as honestly and clearly as I could, careful not to embellish or minimize anything that had happened during those tense hours near the damaged outpost. It was only when a delegate from a heavily shielded, defense-oriented species raised a pointed question about our restraint protocols that the true purpose of the hearing became clear. She asked, in a tone that carried more suspicion than genuine curiosity, whether our decision to disable rather than destroy the attacking vessels had been a calculated act of mercy, or simply a demonstration designed to showcase precision control over weapons the galaxy had only recently learned to fear. I paused before answering, choosing my words carefully, aware that whatever I said would likely be repeated and analyzed far beyond the walls of this small chamber. I explained, as plainly as I could, that our engagement protocols had never been designed around demonstration or performance. They were built around a simple, practical principle that Priya Sen had first explained to me years earlier during my initial training: minimize unnecessary harm wherever possible, while ensuring the primary objective, protecting those who could not protect themselves, remained fully achieved. It was not mercy calculated for an audience. It was, quite simply, the same philosophy that had shaped every aspect of our approach to conflict since long before any of us had ever left our home system. A different delegate, an older being, with a calm, measured voice, asked a question that struck me as considerably more honest than most of what had come before. He wanted to know whether humanity intended to continue expanding its military presence along contested regions of the galaxy, now that recent events had demonstrated our capabilities so clearly. I understood, listening to the careful phrasing of his question, that beneath the formal language lay a far simpler, more human concern. He was afraid not of what we had already done, but of what we might choose to do next. I did not have the authority to speak on behalf of humanity's broader military policy, and I said as much clearly. But I offered my own honest perspective, shaped by everything I had witnessed since joining the crew of the Reckoning. I told the chamber that our presence near that damaged outpost had not been the result of ambition or expansion, but simple proximity and a willingness to respond when others could not. I reminded them, as gently as I could manage, that the very fear now driving this hearing was the same fear that had once led an entire galaxy to laugh at our cannons, dismissing decades of careful preparation as nothing more than an outdated relic of a less sophisticated species. The chamber fell quiet for a long moment after that response, delegates exchanging glances that carried far more meaning than any of the formal questions that had preceded it. I did not know, standing there at that modest podium, whether my words had done anything to ease the tension gathered around me, or whether they had simply confirmed exactly the concerns the delegates had arrived with. Ambassador Whitfield joined me briefly after the hearing concluded, her expression difficult to read as we walked together back through the station's winding corridors. She told me, quietly, that testimony like mine, however uncomfortable it might have felt in the moment, was exactly what the council needed to hear. Comfortable answers, she explained, were easy to dismiss. Honest ones tended to linger, whether the audience wanted them to or not. Over the following days, I learned that similar hearings were being conducted across multiple subcommittees, each examining different aspects of humanity's growing military reputation, with a mixture of caution and undisguised anxiety. Reports filtered back to the Reckoning describing heated debates among delegates over how best to respond to a species that had, in the span of only a few months, transformed itself from a subject of ridicule into an object of genuine concern. Captain Blake remained notably calm throughout this period, reminding the crew during a private briefing that fear, much like the earlier mockery we had endured, revealed more about the fears of those expressing it than it did about anything we had actually done. He encouraged us not to take the growing tension personally, framing it instead as a natural, if uncomfortable, part of a much larger transition the entire galaxy was slowly being forced to navigate. I found myself reflecting often, during those quiet weeks of continued scrutiny, on how strange it felt to move from being an object of laughter to an object of fear in such a short span of time. Neither reaction, I realized, had ever truly been about us. Both had been shaped entirely by the comfortable assumptions the rest of the galaxy held about its own safety. Assumptions that our simple, old-fashioned philosophy had quietly, unintentionally, begun to dismantle piece by piece. Selvantor, who had accompanied portions of our delegation throughout these hearings, offered a perspective one evening that stayed with me long after our conversation ended. He observed that fear, unlike laughter, at least carried the potential for genuine understanding, provided both sides were willing to sit with the discomfort long enough to learn from it, rather than simply reacting against it. I hoped, listening to his words, that he was right, though I understood clearly enough that hope alone would not be sufficient to guide an entire galaxy through the uncertain path that now stretched out ahead of us. I found Captain Blake alone in the observation deck late one evening, several weeks after our return from the council station, staring out at the same endless field of stars that had become such a familiar backdrop to so many of my own quiet reflections. He did not seem surprised when I entered, simply gestured toward the empty space beside him without turning away from the viewport. We stood together in silence for a while, the kind of comfortable silence that only develops between people who have shared something neither of them fully knows how to put into words. Eventually, he spoke, his voice softer than the commanding tone I usually associated with him on the bridge. He asked whether I had given much thought to why humanity had never fully abandoned kinetic weapons, even during the decades when doing so might have made our early diplomatic relationships considerably easier. I admitted that I understood the practical explanation well enough, the one Priya Sen had given so many times during our training. Our shields were weak, our alternatives limited, and cannons simply worked regardless of what defenses stood against them, but I confessed that I had never fully understood the deeper reasoning behind that choice, the part that went beyond simple engineering necessity. Blake nodded slowly, as if he had expected exactly this answer. He told me about his own grandfather, a man who had lived through one of the last major conflicts fought entirely on Earth's surface, long before humanity had ever imagined reaching beyond its own solar system. His grandfather had rarely spoken about those years directly, but the lessons he passed down had shaped an entire philosophy that eventually found its way into the design of every ship humanity built once it finally reached the stars. He explained that those old conflicts had taught humanity something the rest of the galaxy, in its long centuries of comfortable peace, had apparently forgotten entirely. Safety was never something that could be permanently secured through elegance or sophistication alone. It required constant, sometimes uncomfortable vigilance, a willingness to prepare for outcomes that comfortable civilizations preferred to imagine were no longer possible. Humanity had learned that lesson through considerable hardship and had simply refused to unlearn it once the opportunity to do so eventually presented itself. I asked him, somewhat hesitantly, whether he ever worried that this same vigilance might eventually lead us toward the very conflicts we had spent so long preparing to avoid. It was a question that had been quietly troubling me since our testimony before the Council subcommittee, one I had not quite found the courage to voice until that moment. Blake considered the question carefully before answering, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. He told me that the fear I was describing was not unreasonable, and that wise people throughout history had wrestled with exactly the same concern. Preparation, taken too far, could indeed become its own kind of danger, feeding suspicion and escalation rather than genuine safety, but he believed, based on everything he had witnessed throughout his long career, that the greater danger lay not in careful preparation, but in the comfortable illusion that preparation was no longer necessary at all. He reminded me of the scavenger fleet we had turned away with nothing more than a single warning shot, and the survivors we had pulled from a damaged outpost that no amount of elegant diplomacy would have saved in time. Neither outcome, he pointed out, had required us to seek out conflict. They had simply required us to remain capable of responding when conflict inevitably found us, a reality the rest of the galaxy had spent generations trying to convince itself no longer applied to their comfortable advanced civilizations. I thought about Selvantor's words from weeks earlier, about fear at least carrying the potential for genuine understanding, and I found myself wondering aloud whether that potential was already beginning to take shape across the wider galaxy. Blake offered a small, tired smile at that question, admitting that he honestly did not know, though he remained cautiously hopeful that the recent months had opened a door that could lead toward something more constructive than either the mockery or the fear we had already experienced. We talked for a long while after that, moving beyond questions of philosophy and history into quieter, more personal territory. Blake shared stories about his early years in service, long before he had ever imagined commanding a ship like the Reckoning, describing the uncertainty and self-doubt that had shaped his own path toward leadership. I found myself sharing my own doubts in return, admitting how often I had questioned whether I belonged aboard this ship during those early months when the rest of the galaxy still viewed us as an embarrassing curiosity. He listened carefully, without offering easy reassurance, simply acknowledging that doubt, much like fear, was rarely something to be eliminated entirely. It was, in his experience, something to be understood and worked through carefully, rather than dismissed or ignored. I appreciated the honesty in his response far more than I would have appreciated any comfortable, empty reassurance. Later that evening, as our conversation wound down and Blake prepared to return to his quarters for the night, he offered one final thought that stayed with me long after he had gone. He said that the true measure of humanity's philosophy would not be found in the dramatic engagements that had already earned us so much attention across the galaxy, but in the countless smaller, quieter moments that would inevitably follow. How we treated those who feared us, how we responded to those who continued to doubt us, whether we remained committed to restraint even when circumstances might tempt us towards something far less careful. I carried his words with me over the following days, reflecting on them during quiet moments throughout my regular duties aboard the ship. I thought about Priya Sen's patient explanations during those early training sessions, about Lieutenant Finch's quiet confidence during our tensest engagements, about Selvantor's genuine curiosity replacing his earlier skepticism, about Ambassador Whitfield's careful diplomacy, navigating a galaxy still struggling to understand exactly what our presence now meant for its future. Each of them, in their own way, embodied a small piece of the same philosophy Captain Blake had described that evening on the observation deck. We were not a crew defined by ambition or a desire to prove our superiority over the rest of the galaxy. We were, at our core, simply a group of people who had inherited a difficult lesson from our own troubled history, and who remained committed to honoring that lesson even when doing so invited scrutiny, suspicion, or outright fear from those who had not yet learned to understand it. I did not know, standing alone on the observation deck after Blake had finally retired for the night, exactly what the coming months would bring for the reckoning, or for humanity's uncertain place within the wider galaxy. But I understood, perhaps for the first time since that humiliating broadcast from the council chamber so many months earlier, that whatever came next, we would face it the same way we had faced everything before it. Carefully, honestly, prepared, but never eager, for whatever the galaxy still had left to teach us. The formal vote came nearly a year after the day the council first laughed at our diagrams, delivered through a broadcast that reached every ship and colony across Allied space simultaneously. I watched it from the same mess hall where I had once sat in humiliated silence, surrounded now by crewmates who had grown considerably more accustomed to attention than any of us had ever expected to become. Humanity's application for full council membership had passed, not with overwhelming enthusiasm, but with a careful, deliberate majority that reflected exactly the complicated relationship our species had built with the wider galaxy over the preceding months. Ambassador Whitfield, watching the results alongside senior officers on the bridge, described the outcome afterward not as a celebration, but as an acknowledgement, a recognition that humanity's uncomfortable philosophy had earned a permanent, undeniable place within galactic affairs. I felt a quiet satisfaction hearing the news, though it carried none of the triumphant excitement I might have once imagined feeling in this moment. Too much had happened since that first humiliating broadcast for simple triumph to feel like the right response. We had watched a galaxy shift from mockery to fear to something far more complicated, a cautious, evolving respect built on hard evidence rather than comfortable assumption. Lieutenant Finch found me on the observation deck later that evening, a place that had quietly become something of a personal tradition for me over the preceding months. She carried 2 cups of something warm, offering one to me as she settled into the space beside the viewport. We stood together for a while without speaking, watching the same endless stretch of stars that had witnessed so many of my own private reflections since this entire journey began. She eventually broke the silence, observing quietly that our admission into the council felt less like an ending and more like the beginning of something considerably larger. I found myself nodding in agreement, thinking about Priya Sen's reports, describing the growing number of allied species, quietly investing in kinetic weapon research, technology that had been dismissed as primitive only a year earlier and was now being studied with careful, serious attention across a dozen different worlds. I asked her whether she thought this shift represented genuine progress or simply a slower, more gradual return to the kind of careful vigilance the galaxy had abandoned generations earlier. She considered the question thoughtfully before answering, admitting that she was not entirely certain the distinction mattered as much as it once might have seemed to. Perhaps, she suggested, genuine progress sometimes looked exactly like remembering something valuable that had been temporarily forgotten, rather than discovering something entirely new. Selvantor joined us shortly afterward, having requested a formal transfer to remain aboard the Reckoning as a permanent liaison, rather than returning to his original assignment once our diplomatic exchange officially concluded. He shared, during that quiet gathering on the observation deck, that his own government had recently approved a significant expansion of their kinetic weapons research program, a decision that would have seemed almost unthinkable to him only a year earlier. He admitted, with a small, wry smile, that watching an entire civilization slowly relearn lessons humanity had never forgotten felt like an oddly humbling experience, one that had reshaped his understanding of progress far more thoroughly than any of his previous assumptions about advanced technology ever had. I appreciated his honesty, recognizing in his words the same quiet transformation I had witnessed unfold across so many of our interactions with allied species throughout the preceding months. Captain Blake addressed the entire crew later that night, gathering us together one final time before our official celebration of the Council's decision. His words carried the same careful, measured tone I had come to associate with every significant moment of our journey together, a tone that avoided easy triumph in favor of something considerably more thoughtful. He reminded us that our admission into the Council did not mark the end of humanity's responsibility toward the philosophy that had brought us this far, but rather the beginning of a new, more complicated chapter in which that philosophy would be tested even further. He spoke about the quiet arms race now unfolding across allied space, species rushing to reconsider technology they had once dismissed as obsolete, and reminded us that this shift, however necessary, carried its own genuine risks. A galaxy rearming itself out of fear, he cautioned, was not automatically a safer galaxy, regardless of how justified that fear might initially appear. Our responsibility, he explained, was not simply to demonstrate strength, but to model the same careful restraint that had guided every decision we had made since that first humiliating broadcast so many months earlier. I thought about his words long after the gathering ended, standing alone once more on the observation deck as the rest of the crew slowly dispersed toward their quarters for a rare, well-earned night of rest. I thought about the laughter that had once greeted our diagrams, the fear that had eventually replaced it, and the cautious, complicated respect that had finally emerged from that difficult journey. None of it, I realized, had ever truly been about proving humanity's superiority over the rest of the galaxy. It had always been about something considerably simpler and considerably more difficult to fully explain to those who had not lived through it themselves. We had remembered a lesson the rest of the galaxy had chosen to forget, and in remembering it, we had quietly, unintentionally, forced an entire civilization to begin remembering it as well. I did not know, standing there beneath that endless field of stars, exactly what challenges still waited for us in the uncertain years ahead, as allied fleets across 100 worlds slowly rebuilt themselves around lessons my own ancestors had paid dearly to learn. But I understood, perhaps more clearly than I ever had before, that whatever came next, humanity would face it the same way we always had, not with the desire for conflict, but with the quiet, stubborn refusal to ever again be caught unprepared for it. The stars outside the viewport remained exactly as distant and silent as they had always been, indifferent to the slow, complicated transformation unfolding across the galaxy beneath them. But somewhere within that vast, quiet darkness, I knew that ships across 100 worlds were beginning to change, engineers reconsidering old assumptions, officers re-examining old doubts, entire civilizations slowly, reluctantly, relearning a lesson that had once made an entire galaxy laugh at the sight of a single, stubborn species that had simply refused to forget.